Hi, my name is Jamie. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford. I'm currently living in London. I've been finding it quite difficult to do my research recently, and I think it's because I've got a lot of things going on in my head, and a lot of things, especially surrounding current affairs, um, which I'd like to just sort of share with you. I'm thinking these blogs will just be a way to, I'm not expecting anything from them, it's just a way of sort of getting ideas out there into the open and seeing what people think. And by all means, disagree with anything I have to say. I promise to try and keep it civil. So reading the London Review of Books this week, and there's a topic here which I think a lot of people are missing, especially in the UK in the context of Brexit and other more immediate domestic concerns. And there's an article in here by Tony Wood, which I'd like to read to you, and I will occasionally stop and engage in some commentary and talk about it after the fact. I'll try and link the article below in the comments, and I'll also put a timestamp so when I've stopped reading it, there's more analysis. But if you want to just hear my sultry tones, by all means, continue, and I will try and dip and dab into some commentary while it's happening. So it won't just be a strict reading of the topic. On the 23rd of January, the anniversary of a revolt that toppled the dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez in 1958, the head of Venezuela's National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, declared himself interim president, but the crisis has been long in the making. Most of the Venezuelan opposition boycotted the presidential election held last May, in which Nicolás Maduro was standing for a second term, and refused to recognise his victory or the legitimacy of his new term in office. Within hours of Guaidó's announcement, by contrast, the US, Canada, Brazil, Argentina and Colombia, among other states in the Western Hemisphere, had recognised him as Venezuela's president. 2 weeks later, however, Maduro remains in the Miraflores, and it's unclear whether we're witnessing Trump's first attempt at regime change or a failed coup. I mean, already I have things to say about the use of the word regime change, which I'll get into in a sec. There's no doubting the extent of the economic and social disaster Venezuela is experiencing. Beset by 5-digit inflation, food shortages, and rising poverty and unemployment, the economy contracted by more than a third between 2013 and 2018, and has slid even further since. This has wiped out the real gains made by most of the population between the mid-2000s and the time roughly when Maduro succeeded Hugo Chavez as president in April 2013. I would just very quickly say that I wouldn't say that's wiped out most of the real gains made. So extreme poverty in Venezuela was at 25%, I believe, before Hugo Chavez came into power, and it's at 4.4% now, and unfortunately rising. So it's slightly an exaggeration to suggest that the current crisis has completely destroyed the progress it's made, but it's not looking good. There has been a wave of emigration spanning the social spectrum. By November 2018, the UNHRC estimated that as many as 3 million had left the country, with 80% of them now scattered across Latin America and the Caribbean. There is no doubting either that Maduro has failed to address this crisis. Hampered by the razor-thin margin for which he won his mandate in 2013, 1.5%, he is governed with a combination of bluster and repression. He stuck to a disastrous exchange rate policy, even though it was visibly making things worse for most of the population. Frustrated by the opposition-controlled National Assembly, he made aggressive and self-defeating moves against it, going as far as to decree its dissolution in 2017, though as we can see it's continued to function. But it's also true that economically any Venezuelan leader would have been weakened by the slump in global oil prices that began in mid-2014. The effects of this were made even worse by the US sanctions that started under Obama, who in March 2015 declared Venezuela, quote, an extraordinary threat to US national security. And under Trump, they've been extended several times. So there's been 3 sanctions since Obama. But what's particularly shocking is the idea that Venezuela, a country of almost no military capacity beyond, its defence of its borders, and that may in fact be tested in the next few weeks and months, poses an extraordinary security risk, to me smacks of quite cynical propaganda, and it's the sort of thing that Barack Obama got away with, and that liberals to this day allowed him to get away with. Obviously, I condemn Donald Trump's continuation of these sanctions, and I think it just speaks to the idea that Venezuela was always going to be perceived as an enemy, regardless of who was in charge of it, unless that person was a quite literal American appointed puppet. But Maduro's intransigence has been more than matched by that of the opposition. Its leaders are fervently committed to overturning Chavismo, driven by a visceral loathing that often comes with a strong dose of racism. So I don't think this is in the article, but there's another thing that's important to note is remember that the opposition of Hugo Chavez, a lot of them were incredibly racist. There's a big racial difference between those who are Chavistas and Chavismo in the movement and the opposition leaders, which are basically economic elites, people who used to own shares in the privatized oil industry that was nationalized. And they would refer to Chavez as a monkey, and they would say things like blacks shouldn't be allowed to run the economy. And it was only until I think 2011 Chavez made it confirmed in the census of Venezuela that Afro-Venezuelan was a category of people, and it was illegal to racially discriminate against them. This is another thing, the racial aspect of Venezuela, and it turns out America supports the white side of Venezuela. That's another important aspect, which is completely neglected, especially in the UK press. There's no talk of, aside from this article in the LRB, hence me mentioning it, there's been absolutely no talk of the sort of racial element. The first direct challenges to Maduro's rule came in early 2014 with a series of protests, the Guarimbas, I'm sorry for completely destroying that word, led mainly by the middle class and students. Then, in December 2015, the opposition gained control of the National Assembly, the first time it had a majority there since Chavez took office in 1999. So this shows you how piss poor Maduro has been in continuing Chavez's legacy. With this, an institutional deadlock came into being that has lasted to this day. Chavistas are in charge of the executive, and since Maduro designated a new Supreme Court in 2015, the judiciary, but the opposition has a legislature and refuses to recognise the authority of the other two branches of government. It's this deadlock that the opposition has now moved to break with the aid of massive external pressure on Maduro. Massive external pressure is a understatement, I would say. Venezuela's opposition is a fractious alliance of different tendencies, but for the past few years has been dominated by its most vociferously right-wing components. Their single-minded focus on removing Maduro has spread to the rest of the opposition. Even moderates, such as the former Minister of Planning, Ricardo Haussmann, has recently begun openly calling for a US military intervention. During last year's Brazilian election campaign, Jair Bolsonaro, hinted at military action in Venezuela. After he won, Guaido's party, Voluntad Popular, congratulated him and hoped he would, quote, rescue liberty and democracy in Venezuela. I genuinely think that's all you need to know about this. Jair Bolsonaro is literally the most dangerous far-right politician in the world today. If you know anything about him, you'll know that he's basically a risible individual. He's currently got, at the time of recording, I believe it's hypothermia, something like that. Anyway, he's in hospital and I hope he dies there. And anyone who believes in democracy or freedom or equality or any of the public goods in this world should also be wishing him ill. The idea that he would just give you liberty and democracy is a complete fallacy, and also shows the sort of inherent racism, the fact that you would turn to this outright, borderline Hitler-esque guy who's won on very dubious and often sort of definitely on a sort of least worst option where there were no other options type of candidature, driven by sort of a right-wing nativist populist hate hurricane. The idea that this guy would help you, and he'd help you via helping the US kill the opposition. That basically shows the kind of person that Guaido is, that he would even mention that, in my opinion. Voluntad Popular is a small party with only 14 out of 167 seats, but he wants to be president. But in January, it took up the Assembly's presidency under a rotation designed to stop infighting within the opposition. So he's only there because of the rotation rule. This put Guaido in pole position, which is perfect, by the way, because he's the only. We'll see why. Now 35, he studied in Washington, D.C., but came of age politically during the anti-Chavez protests of 2007. Now, his father, this is where it gets interesting, because Tony Wood is actually a very balanced writer in this field. So there's an interview in the Daily Telegraph with Guaido's father, who's a taxi cab driver, which they keep saying, to show his working class roots. Nicolas Maduro's dad is a bus driver. Bus drivers make less in Venezuela than taxi drivers. Taxi drivers are relatively middle class in comparison to bus drivers. So this whole idea of who has the poorest father is sort of going nowhere. But his father says that he was radicalized by the fact that there was a earthquake in his village, and this earthquake made him hate Chavez. Now, bearing in mind that Chavez always tried to allocate resources as quickly as possible to certain disaster areas. In fact, he offered the US aid for Hurricane Katrina, which George Bush turned down, and the US did fuck all to help Hurricane Katrina, and then they did nothing to help Puerto Rico. Right now, you got Flint, Michigan. They still don't have water that's drinkable. The fact that Obama came out 6 months ago and said it was drinkable, following establishment Democrats and Republicans, so that people think it's over when it's not. It's still a crisis, and the fact that the idea that this would be the thing which makes you hate Chavez is super dubious, and it's probably the reason why Tony Wood hasn't used that, because it literally makes no sense, and it seems like his father just made up some random thing. So yeah, although he was widely feted in the Western press since his auto-anointment, he wasn't well known in Venezuela before the 23rd of January, and even now it's unclear how much support he personally can command. Well, it's not unclear. Of the people that know him, which is 20% of the population of Venezuela, 80% of the Venezuelans, by the latest independent polling coming out of Venezuela, says that 80% of the population have no idea who this guy was, just complete random. No one knew who this guy was, because it's the legislature and it's a rotational role, and he's one of a small party which is sort of supposed to be a centre-left party that's become Blairite in character. I mean, he's mass privatisation, but it's a very odd mixture of stuff. Of the people who know him, 11% of them are in favour of him. So of the people who know him, they're his guy. But most people have no idea who he is. So the idea that he can appoint himself president through this sort of technicality, and that the idea that the people are behind him is, let's just say, hogwash, to be kind. And much the same can be said for the opposition as a whole. It's often boycotted elections it wasn't likely to win, which is the important thing. This is what Nicolas Maduro says in his BBC interview. Oh, why wouldn't you call fresh elections? Well, it was like, well, we did, and they weren't rigged, and I won. And then, secondly, they have the presidential recall in the constitution, which Chavez has actually had to fight against. And also, he lost a vote to change the constitution, which implies a level of democracy even higher than the United Kingdom, for example. And also, Guaido can challenge him next time. It's just like any other democratic country. Next democratic election, every single Venezuelan election has been declared completely legitimate and fair by every single international body, including American ones, including the Jimmy Carter Institute, including international observers in 2015. Donald Trump said in 2016 rather, that any election in Venezuela is going to be considered legitimate as long as there's a Chavez or pro-Chavez person in charge. And that's been the American position since 1999. Even when Chavez was making massive gains in the country and everyone loved him, he was a vicious tyrant. Not to suggest there's any the problems in the state don't exist. Of course they do. There's all kinds of problems with the state, and I'm not a particular fan of Nicolas Maduro. But the idea that Guaido is the answer is the stuff of the Economist magazine wet dream. Sometimes it has adopted this refusing stance even when it did win. In October 2017, it took 5 out of the 23 state governorships, but told its candidates not to take the oath of office, and 4 of them disobeyed the instruction. So this is the sort of colour revolution strategy coming in. Obviously, the US are in their ear and basically said, well, if you accept the oath and you accept your seats, you're accepting the legitimacy of the whole system, which is obviously legitimate. So think sort of a right-wing version of the Sinn Féin situation in Britain. The idea being like Sinn Féin don't want to acknowledge the British government's stuff in Ireland, so it wins seats but doesn't actually go to British Parliament, doesn't vote. They don't take up their seats. America was like, oh, do that with Venezuela to show how bad the government is or whatever, and to, you know, it's not worked so far, and it's weird that it's working now, and I think that's what I'm going to get into. In the 2018 presidential election, a section of the opposition backed Henri Falcon, the former governor of Lara State, who split from Chavez in 2010, but the rest decided on a boycott. Maduro won 68% of the vote on a turnout of 46%, which is a historic low by Venezuelan standards, but it is quite literally par for the course in the US or the UK, for example, until the recent general election in the UK. 46% turnout. Unlike Georgia, for example, in the midterms, and unlike in pretty much all American states in terms of voter ID problems and fraud, there's been absolutely no claim that people were being, refused the right to vote in Venezuela. So although loads of people didn't bother turning out because they wanted to show, disenfranchisement and disillusionment with the government, which they're completely entitled to do, this is a level of apathy which in the West prompts people like me to write books about political apathy and the end of politics. But for some reason, when this sort of level of political apathy in elites happens in Venezuela, we have to go in with guns and kill people. Guaido's claim to power rests on the idea that since this vote was invalid, which is not true, not only is Maduro not the legitimate president, but according to a transition law, the opposition released on 8th of January, there is no president. Constitutionally, this is shaky ground. Article 233 of the 1999 Venezuelan Constitution specifies the circumstances under which a president can be replaced: death, resignation, removal by the Supreme Court, physical or mental incapacity, and abandonment of post. So, physical or mental incapacity, so Trump should have gone already in America by these standards. Abandonment of post, basically they're going to try and make him flee the country, maybe hide in Cuba, and then presumably threaten his life to the extent that he tries to leave, and then say that he abandoned his post would be potentially one of the military strategies. The National Assembly has a supervisory role to play in each of these scenarios, but nowhere does the Constitution say the legislature can claim executive power for itself. This is why the opposition instead cites Article 333, a provision that extorts citizens to help re-establish constitutional order in the event it is derogated by an act of force. In other words, the opposition is claiming the Constitution no longer applies, but in the resulting, quote, state of exception, where have we heard that before? Carl Schmitt, Nazi. That's a low blow, but yeah. The National Assembly is empowered to bring it into effect once more, as soon as Maduro, whom is called a usurper, is removed. Another significant detail, Article 233 requires new elections within 30 days, but the opposition's transition law makes no such specific requirement. So you've heard this thing of Maduro has to call fresh elections now, otherwise he's basically proving he's a tyrant, and that there's no sort of legal base on that. They've just tried to mix the two different rules together to sort of have this maximum like rule vagueness, ambiguity, that's what the combination of those words were. The transition law is also light on specifics about the opposition's programme for governing Venezuela. Well, let's just guess, and presumably it's privatise everything, give the oil to the Americans. Let's have a look. Although the outlines are clear, remember this guy is supposed to be the equivalent of the Labour Party in Venezuela, right? The Guaido is supposed to be basically the Jeremy Corbyn of Labour, and Nicolas Maduro is a crazy far-left authoritarian, right? So this is the Labour Party, supposedly speaking, in this country. Quote, the centralised model of economic control will be replaced by a model of freedom and markets. The Chavista social programmes will be replaced by direct, i.e. monetary subsidies. So that's removing democracy, because the Chavista social programmes are sort of like bottom-up programmes involved with like assemblies and the barrios and like direct democracy and things. So they want to dismantle that and just go to like a Western style, like take your benefits, mate, we can cut it at any time situation. Public enterprises will undergo a process of restructuring, basically PwC will come in, including public-private agreements, privatizations. So what's being promised is a return to the conventional neoliberal wisdom of the 1990s, precisely the set of policies which produced misery in Venezuela. And let's remember, they were the reason people voted for Chavez in 1999 is because Venezuela was even worse than it is now. Indeed, the policies that produced misery and propelled Chavez to power in the first place. Thank you, Tony. At stake here is the fate not just of Maduro, but the whole Bolivarian model. It's no accident this comes at a moment when the right is flexing its muscles across Latin America. The eagerness with which forces outside Venezuela are seeking to put pay to Chavismo is all too apparent. The pressure on Maduro has been ratcheted up by the Lima Group, established in August 2017 specifically to work with the Venezuelan opposition to find a solution to the crisis. And this is the problem, because you've got two crises, right, in the eyes of the Western media. You've got the crisis, which is the fact the economy is doing shit, with loads of sanctions being imposed on it, and the UK government, withholding certain, gold from Venezuela. So they've taken $2 billion worth of gold from Venezuela, but want to give them $8 million in aid. Think about that for a second. So this is all the context, but then also you've got that crisis, the economic crisis, which could be helped through. There are easily peaceful solutions to this crisis, including giving people back money you've stolen from them. But then you've also got the crisis of there just being a socialist government, of the fact that the Bolivarian revolution is happening, the fact that there is a socialist in charge of this country, is also a crisis de facto in the eyes of the West, specifically America and its allies. So the Lima Group consists of 12 countries, all of them in the Western Hemisphere, and predominantly governed by parties of the right. That any self-appointed outside body should have a say in a given country's affairs is bad enough, but this ad hoc juncta's credentials for pronouncing on democracy in Venezuela are pitiful. In the short time since it was founded, 2 of its member states have been governed by unelected presidents, Brazil and Peru. One of them has a president who was re-elected by a rigged vote in 2017, Honduras. Search Hillary Clinton, Honduras 2017. She was very instrumental in that, and when Americans are like, lock her up. Yeah, for that, not for bloody Benghazi or because of some made-up conspiracy theory. Just look at what she did in Honduras. One is another UN investigation for corruption, so that's Guatemala. One has been investigated by the DEA for laundering drug money, Paraguay. And there's no forgetting Colombia, where paramilitary troops routinely murder trade unionists, and where, or wouldn't they love that in Venezuela, and where, according to 2018 figures from the UNHRC, there are nearly 8 million internally displaced people. And to its credit, Mexico, though among the founders of the Lima Group under President Peña Nieto, has distanced itself since López Obrador has come to power. In its founding statement, the Lima Group declared its full support for Venezuela's National Assembly, presumably the second the opposition won it. On the 4th of January this year, upped the ante, stating if Maduro assumed office for a second term the following week, it would consider him a usurper, not coincidentally using the same terminology as the Venezuelan opposition. I mean, it's the most obvious coordinated attack I've ever seen. 2 days later, the General Secretary of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, effectively started the clock on regime change, citing Guaido's, quote, important constitutional responsibility to initiate Venezuela's urgent transition to democracy. So, transition from a socialist to capitalist state. This has nothing to do with democracy, because as we know, if there was an election held tomorrow and America weren't intervening in it, a socialist candidate would win. So as we know right now, the problem is also Maduro's obstinance, because what happens is when you look at the polling, 71% of Venezuelans prefer socialism to capitalism. But a lot of them don't like Maduro. So this is the problem. He's unpopular, socialism isn't. The West are framing this as if Maduro is the only man in Venezuela who wants socialism, and he wants to stay in power. Presumably because he knows that any sort of attempt at an election will involve international observers claiming it's rigged immediately. Even though the same observers said it was fine, America will come in, military base, Colombia will come in, oh, Guaido will be on the ballot for some reason, even though he shouldn't be on the ballot. All things will happen. And that's precisely why the US want to just appoint Guaido. They want to just say Guaido's president, so he can pull back all these things, institute liberal democracy, sell everything off to America, so that a socialist in the future can't do that. I mean, if it's up to them, I think the US will literally rewrite the constitution so that a Venezuelan president can never nationalize the oil again. I mean, that's the level we're getting at. You might think I'm cynical, and let me know in the comments. Am I being too cynical? I mean, I don't think so. Because the UK's position is more tepid. The European position is more like we need there to be a free and fair election. You might think now in this context it's impossible, but they'll try in the future. Maduro is basically saying we can solve this problem that we've created ourselves, that you've contributed to creating without an election. We have term limits. Theresa May and Macron are more unpopular in your countries. Why is Macron the violence in the Gilets jaunes? 30 people, I think, was it 10? No, 10. I'm not saying 30. It was 10 people have now died because of the Gilets jaunes protests. The cops beating them up. 10 people have died. We are not rushing to France to force Macron to hold a vote. And this is the problem. It's this idea of double standards. A developing nation, why are you poor? You know, and then if you try and reduce poverty, we'll put sanctions on you because you're not doing it the way we want, which is through corporations. And then it's caused a crisis. Why are you so poor? Why are the children on the street eating bread or whatever? You know, not having food to eat. It's like the developing world is full of extreme poverty caused by the West, and the West has a go at these countries for still having it. You know, it's utterly confusing, and it's a continuation of what I perceive to be a sort of subconscious imperial mentality. That even in the UK, when things like Grenfell happen, you know, those people still haven't been rehoused. The Windrush scandal, people are still being deported. You know, these are grounds for military intervention. If we're Egypt, you know, if we were a Latin American country deporting like our black population or whatever. If we were a military country that just, if the government just completely ignored the burning houses of the middle classes or whatever, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and they were socialist, it'd be done. This would be a reason to invade. You know, the fact that it's right wing, capitalist, Brexit loving Theresa May that's ignoring these people, and Sajid Javid as the Home Secretary doing this means that and the fact that we're Britain obviously means that no one's going to invade us. But if you think of a developing nation doing this sort of stuff, this would be the kind of thing that would be used as the human rights abuse to justify intervention. And I think it's got to the point of like it's really hard to not be irredeemably cynical about these things. I think it was the Trump administration that really accelerated the pace of events. Interestingly, because he's worried about being impeached and getting his tax returns, and like he's just had this massive loss of losing the House. And now suddenly, and shutting the government down again today for the second time. Oh, suddenly he wants awards, does he, for popularity's sake? Regime change in Venezuela has been on Washington's agenda since the early 2000s, but the failed coup against Chavez in 2002. Let's talk about that for a second. There was indeed a failed coup. They literally had Chavez kidnapped, told he was going to die. They put a gun to his head, and Chavez was like, "You can kill me. I'll die a martyr." There was mass bring back our Chavez protests on the street. The coup failed. The guy Lopez was jailed for an attempted coup, completely American CIA backed. This guy was going to come in and privatize the oil. Juan Guaido is one of his biggest supporters. This guy is a continuation of American aggression in Latin America. And now that Bolsonaro is there instead of Dilma Rousseff, and Colombia is unprecedentedly right wing and on the border, with happy for American troops to come in. I mean, we're looking at something approaching like, are we the baddies moment here? It's getting pretty real, and it's not a comfortable time to be someone who's a lover of peace. In May 2017, Trump imposed new sanctions on Venezuelan state companies and officials, the first in a series of news tightening measures. There were more in August 2017, in March, May, August, and November 2018, and on the 10th and 28th of January 2019. In August 2018, Trump apparently asked aides why the US can't just invade. Why can't we just go in? Just kill him. But until last month, the White House preferred scenarios for the Venezuelan army to get rid of Maduro on its behalf, which is hilarious because this is stupid. In February 2018, the then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson casually speculated about the possibility of a military coup, and in September, the New York Times reported that the US had been holding secret discussions for the past year with members of the Venezuelan top brass to persuade them to topple their president. These evidently didn't go as planned. On the 10th of January, Mike Pompeo publicly called on the Venezuelan armed forces to remove Maduro, but the Trump administration was already betting on Guaido. Can you just imagine for a second? Just imagine if we just decided, like if Theresa May went on video and just did a video and was like, I'm Theresa May, and I don't like Macron, and I call upon the military to have him just fucking throw him in jail, maybe kill him, and we'll put in whoever we like. He'll make the Brexit negotiations smoother. He's not very popular. Protests have been going on. I'd really like it if the military would just do me a favour. Can you imagine? It's just so crazy that we just are so used to this behaviour from the US and the West in general that whatever you think of Maduro being an incompetent fuckhead, and whatever you think about the crisis in Venezuela, the fact that this is a mentality that we have and we've just normalised, that we just passively accept on the television, and that the newscasters think anyone who disagrees with this idea that we can just arbitrarily kick off with some sort of cretinous conspiratorial far left stooges or something. when you're pretty much an agent of the CIA apparatus if you are mindlessly supporting this coup in the first place. I mean, it's very odd. Yes, these didn't go to plan. The same day, Pompeo called Guaido and assured him if he declared himself interim president, he would have America's backing. Mike Pence did the same on the 22nd of January, the day before his proclamation. So he's literally being given permission by a foreign power to declare himself sovereign over Venezuela. I mean, the guy couldn't be more sort of a puppet if the strings were visible. It's a vassal state situation. I mean, anyone who's played Civ would know what I'm talking about. Trump, Pompeo, and Marco Rubio were the first to quickly recognise Guaido. The Lima group quickly rubber-stamping the power grab they themselves have helped bring about. On the 4th of February, European countries followed suit. Very sad to see this, because it was like that. It was like, this is an excuse, let's go. I was quite surprised. I didn't think they were going to get involved. They recognised Guaido after the expiry of a tough but pointless ultimatum. They had given Maduro 8 days to commit to holding new elections. That wasn't even the original, do you remember that? Yeah. So what happens next? There is a frighteningly clear path ahead to an escalation of the crisis, including military intervention by the US, possibly alongside its ideological bedfellows in Brazil and Colombia. Having pushed for regime change, the US is not likely to back down quickly. And the scary thing is, even in the event Trump is impeached as Mike Pence, even if there is some sort of unprecedented, bipartisan Trump resigns situation, the Democrats will still want to murder Venezuelans and cause a civil war, and harm the poorest in society that will fight against this, and protect Guaido with military military force if there is counter-revolutionary resistance, which there definitely will be, because even people who don't like Maduro have no fucking clue who Guaido is, and most of them don't even see him as necessarily the guy to solve the problems. Needless to say, by far majority, most Venezuelans don't want the oil privatized, and they do not want any US intervention whatsoever, even if it involves getting rid of Maduro, who they also in general don't like. Of the people, they hate all politicians, but they actually hate Maduro the least. He's actually still the most popular. And that's what's so confusing about this whole thing. He is more popular than most Western leaders right now, apart from maybe Merkel in Germany. And yet he is still framed as this crazy guy who just wants to hold on to power. I mean, George Eaton, supposedly woke George Eaton in the New Statesman, wrote an article referring to him as the Stalin of Latin America, just because someone said, you're like Stalin or whatever, and he jokingly said, yeah, we've got the same moustache. And he's written that out like, he admits it. He wants to gulag all the children he's kept alive through the social benefit programs that he supports. My lord. Right. As if to signal US intentions, on the 25th of January, Trump appointed as his special envoy to Venezuela Elliot Abrams, the man who ran the Reagan administration's dirty wars in Central America. You may have seen the viral Twitter account with the new congresswoman, the Muslim congresswoman who was called an anti-Semite for pointing out something that is true. She's the only one who stood up to him. Everybody else was like, oh, Elliot Abrams, you're just coming back in from Hades, how are you? And he worked in the Bush White House during the last US-backed coup attempt in Venezuela in 2002, having been pardoned for war crimes. I mean, basically, if this guy was African, he'd already be dead for war crimes. Being American means you can do anything, and basically you can survive it. The most startling and most disgusting thing about this is, I'm going to have to find her name, and I do apologise to her. I don't want to get it wrong. I'm not going to get it wrong. I'm just going to say. So she confronts him, says, why should we trust you? You're a bastard or whatever. Elliot Abrams, how dare you question me just because I murdered thousands of people and had children's throats slit? They leave the hall. She is mobbed by journalists, including a CNN journalist. Why are you saying all these things to Elliot Abrams? Whoa, whoa, whoa. And he just gets to slink off. An actual war criminal. Madness. It's very nice to be back, Abrams said. Guaido and his external backers clearly expecting Maduro to be removed in short order. So let's just get this straight for a second. So even if you are a proper, centre-left James Bloodworth type, and you think Maduro is the devil, you are supporting Elliot Abrams, who is literally worse than any imagined version of Maduro in his potential destruction of this country. And you know Guaido is definitely the only person at the point. So you know that the Venezuelan people won't get a say. You know Guaido will be imposed. And you know America will just use this to get oil. Why would you give Trump a free war, endanger the lives of thousands of people, endanger the lives of these people for a minority opposition which have ruled the country previously and fucked it up royally, empower fascism in Latin America and indeed the world? I mean, my fear is for Bolivia. I mean, once Venezuela goes down, they'll be after Cuba. But Bolivia, which is a thriving democracy doing great under a socialist president, that'll be gone. He'll be a bloody crook somehow as well. I mean, the far right is rising in the world. How anyone who claims they're a liberal or centre left is supporting the removal of this guy, who's a completely it's just madness to me. I mean, anything you could accuse Maduro of, like Theresa May has literally done worse. So, if you're not a fan of Maduro, guys, get yourself a machine gun and storm Parliament. Stay out of Venezuela. Anyway, it is not Venezuela. Oh, right. Guaido and his external backers clearly expected Maduro to be removed in short order. That he has not suggests a greater degree of support for him inside Venezuela than the US bargained for, which is crazy because you spent 20 years making most of the opposition newspapers think of the Chavista revolution as a terrible thing, and most journalists see themselves as in opposition to the regime. Everyone basically that isn't Telus hates Chavez and Maduro. It's bizarre that it's still popular, which seems to imply that maybe Venezuelan people aren't idiots. Like the idea that they're all idiots and this guy has to be like murdered and some of them killed for their own good because they're supporting their own oppression. I mean, it's a sort of ideological fantasy that sort of even the most unreconstructed Marxist would never claim is happening in capitalist countries. The basic fact of sovereignty still matters to enough people. For others, a transition shaped by the US may seem too high a price to pay for his removal. Yeah. I mean, I don't like Theresa May, but if Donald Trump was like, oh, do you want us to fucking kill her for you? I'd be like, no. The longer Maduro remains in the Miraflores, the more successfully he will be able to depict Guaido's parallel government as the creature of outside powers, which is literally true. Whatever this crisis is about, it isn't about restoring democracy and prosperity to Venezuela. To read the Western press, you would think the country's people were at last about to be set free from tyranny under which they've been groaning for years in a Caribbean rerun of the Arab Spring. But we've been here many times before. In Latin America alone, the long and disastrous record of US-led interventions is enough to cause alarm about the possible outcomes of this crisis. Even if Maduro is levered out of power, the battle for Venezuela is just beginning. If Maduro is killed, there will be counter-revolutions on the street, the likes of which we will not see in other countries. You will not see in the Arab Spring. The way the BBC did their interview with Nicolas Maduro was disgraceful. They tried to set him up like he was Gaddafi or Assad, like he had this horrendous torture chamber, and that the regime was, the Venezuela was on fire, and they were parroting North Korean level propaganda level questions at him. But one thing that did strike me as I was thinking, this is a good grilling of a president. They're asking him proper questions, what's the price of cheese? How can you sit there and watch children go hungry and stuff? And I was like, imagine if they actually grew a spine and interviewed people in the West like this. Imagine if Theresa May was sat down and they were just like, how can you sleep at night knowing the Grenfell people haven't been homed? How can you sleep at night knowing that, the Windrush generation are being treated like second-class citizens? At this point, it's obvious racism, wouldn't you admit? Give us a reason to think it's not racism. How much is cheese in the UK? And how will this price be affected by Brexit? How much money is your husband going to make in his hedge fund? Has he priced in a no deal? Has he priced in your deal? How much money will you personally make from the disaster capitalism that could potentially come as a consequence of Brexit? How much of the NHS has been privatised? How can you live with yourself knowing that, the American-style healthcare system is one of the worst in the world? And yet you're going to encourage it in your own country. I don't think that Maduro is a nice guy. He might have good intentions, but he's not particularly good at leading the country, and it's a shame that Hugo Chavez didn't appoint a better successor, but he's also someone who's been elected twice. I mean, this is one of the things, Tony Blair appoints Gordon Brown, we keep going. David Cameron resigns, we get Theresa May. Theresa May didn't even have to call an election. She only called one because she thought she'd get more seats. You know, it's scary because Venezuela is an exceptional case, because Venezuela is arguably a more democratic country than some of the Western countries that are currently trying to overthrow it on grounds of human rights and democracy, and that's the scary thing for me. And also just looking into Guaido, like anything about him, and you know this guy is a con man. You know this guy literally is going to make some money from this. He literally is doing the thing. It's not even subtle anymore. You know, in the 70s, if you said the CIA are doing X, Y, and Z, you were called a conspiracy theorist. But now we know the CIA basically like overthrew regimes. It's in Hollywood movies now. That's how obvious it is. It's even referenced with glee by American politicians. It's a shame the way politics has gone to the point now where you can just outright, you know, say these things and people don't even care. They don't even look. They don't even care. Bringing Elliot Abrams in basically just says we want to cause a genocide of some kind. And the world doesn't care. And there's this weird separation of Trump, the buffoonish guy we mock on Saturday Night Live and on How I've Got News for You, and the regime of government at which he is appointed. And they go, we need to go kill this guy. And then The Economist goes, is it for oil? Sick. All right, let's do it. And there's no connection of like, fascists want to kill this guy. Maybe the other guy isn't that bad, you know. And it's a concern for people who hold socialist views, because it implies that any kind of socialist government, even one in a developing country that's been doing all right, will be sanctioned to fuck. And even if they have democratic popularity in the people, another people will be constructed around some other operative, and this guy will be able to come in on the wave of like money and donorships and the opposition, and just come in and be like, well, half the country doesn't matter. Like the poorest people, you know, the ethnic minorities in the country, the people who wanted this to work as a project which has been working for a while, they're going to be the main sufferers of the retrenchment of that project. They're not even pretending that they're going to improve the lives of Venezuelans. They just literally want to privatize the oil. And the fact that Jeremy Corbyn, I think John McDonnell, and like Chris Williamson are like the only three people in the British government to just point out this is mental, and they are being perceived as like weirdos for caring about sovereignty and like democracy, because like, but I've heard that they're eating rats there and they have 1 billion% inflation, you know, as if these aren't things that like, as if the Americans have never lied about anything ever, and that like these are things you see when you go there. And then all the BBC interview could say in the Maduro interview, well, I've never been to Venezuela before. Great, so you've automatically made yourself a complete ignoramus. But I've been here 2 weeks and I saw poor children. It's like, go anywhere in the world and there'll be poor children. Go to Toxteth, see the people being denied benefits, people committing suicide in the UK. Go to the food banks, you'll see poor children. How could this happen in a democracy? You know, the UN, what's the word? Rapporteur from Australia said there's a massive crisis and the government's in denial about it. Here. But that doesn't justify China declaring Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister without an election and demanding that that China will invade the UK unless, Theresa May immediately steps down. And then the other countries of Asia, like India, agrees for some reason. Like a bunch of arbitrary countries that like China or whatever, like start agreeing and go, yeah, Theresa May, we're going to talk to Jeremy Corbyn now. Can you imagine the centrist liberal mind would explode? They'd be like, this guy's a psychopath. Jeremy Corbyn's a psychopath. Why is he accepting? And imagine if Jeremy Corbyn went, China are right, yeah. Let's suspend all Chinese money into the UK as investment and just put it in my personal bank account for me to use and for me to set up my grand committee, because I am the rightful Prime Minister. Can you imagine how insane that would be? That'd be super bad. That'd be crazy. And yet this is what liberals and centre-left people think is okay to do in other people's countries. Because in order to be against this, to basically, you have the idea is this sort of binary thinking that basically the assumption is everyone on the left just mindlessly supports left-wing governments. They don't critique them at all, and that they just hate the US regardless of what they do. It's like, well, I hate the US when they do bad shit. The scary thing is when the centre goes, let's let the US do bad stuff so that 2 years when everyone's dead, we can all agree it was a terrible mistake. You know, like they all agreed that Libya was a good idea. They all said we have to go and kill Assad or whatever, even though that would have literally, you know, caused the spread of ISIS. And now ISIS is in retrenchment, you know. And they'll probably do this with Iran, because that's John Bolton's next task. He wants to. He's already had a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, and Benjamin Netanyahu, if you don't know the Israeli Prime Minister, he then just tweets out, "We have a shared interest in the war with Iran." So they're not even hiding it anymore. But I guarantee you, the second the US goes, we're going into Iran, the British newspapers, the British press, most of the Labour Party, and most of the European, you know, commentariat will say, well, Iran has a terrible human rights record and it is a terrible country, which is true. But it just still doesn't justify what could be the loss of a lot of lives, and it shows you the value of life that's placed on here. We're going to kill 500,000 people and make some money out of it, but it'll be good for the people who are left, and we'll make that call. Well, it's not an argument against utilitarianism. Anyway, so that was my first blog. It was very long. It was more of a rant than anything. It's more so it's just out of my system, because I've been thinking about this and, you know, trying to think about writing about this as well. But I thought, you know what, rant to camera. You know, people can call me a dickhead, and, you know, that's the best way to do it, isn't it? Put yourself online, have people call you a dickhead. That's the best thing to do. Let me know what you think about this, especially if you're Venezuelan, especially if you're someone who didn't know the context of Venezuela, like you've just heard about Venezuela before. People who've been following Venezuela for a long time, let me know how you feel. Let me know your thoughts. And just in general, this idea of treating some countries to different standards for strategic purposes, which is like the great unspoken truth of foreign policy. I'd like to hear that. I'd love some comments about that, especially from people who are pro-intervention. Yeah. So thanks for watching. I very much doubt you've made the end of this. This is just very much a case of, like, you know, talking at the mirror at this point. But thank you to Tony Wood for an absolutely sick article in the LRB. Do buy it. I'll put a link in the bottom of the description. Please like or dislike, I don't mind, and subscribe. I'm going to be doing stuff like this, probably shorter, but probably involving some sort of prompt, whether that be a news article or an essay, and potentially a discussion topic. But yeah, this is just a bit of fun while I try and work out how to do my PhD. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.